Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the wonderful listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information, or just click on the link below. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Rebecca Batley to the show to chat about her latest book, The Lord Protector and His Wives, Catherine Filliol, Anne Stanhope, and Edward Seymour. Rebecca is a historian and archaeologist with a particular interest in women's history. She's worked for, amongst others, the Louvre, the Museum of London, and Wessex Archaeology. Her work has appeared in many publications, including The New Scientist, Nautilus, History Scotland, and the Nile magazine. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Rebecca. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show and chat to me. So let's just begin with an introduction. Would you mind just saying hello to all our listeners and viewers and just telling us a little bit about you and your background?
Hi everyone. I am a archaeologist and historian by profession, and I started writing history books over lockdown really, so about 5 years ago.
Wonderful. And we're here to talk about one of your books, actually, The Lord Protector and His Wives. So what actually inspired this particular project?
Well, like most people, I've always been fascinated by the Tudors. But there's actually a church not far from here in a place called Little Barrow, which has some of the Filliol family tombs. And I came across them one day, and then obviously started looking for references to the family and came across Catherine Filliol, who was involved in something of a Tudor scandal, but about whom next to nothing is known. So I guess I set out to try and find out if I could find a little more. And of course, learning about her meant researching her husband and his second wife, Anne Stanhope, who rapidly became possibly my favourite historical woman ever. She is just awesome.
Wonderful. And we are going to talk more about those women in a moment. But before we do that, talk to us a little bit about Edward's family and his early life.
Well, Edward Seymour was the son of John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth. John Seymour was older than Henry VIII, but a bit of a rising star at court. He wasn't one of the new men, but he was respected and popular with the king. He had raised men for Henry VIII's invasion of France, and he was present at the Battle of the Spurs. So he was at the court. Marjorie Wentworth, meanwhile, was a famous beauty, and her beauty was praised by the poet John Skelton. And they met, married, and had numerous children, of which one was Edward Seymour, who was born in around 1500. He was one of many children, and in fact, he was originally the Seymour spare because he was the second son. He had an elder brother, John, who sadly died in his teens. But he, like most sort of noble families at the time, obviously his father had influence at court, and he used that to get a position for his son, really, to begin to advance him. And in 1514, Edward was appointed as a page to attend Mary Tudor, the king's sister, when she was sent to France to marry King Louis. And his career sort of took off from there. It wasn't a meteoric rise just yet, but it was a steady one. By about 1516, he was a attendant in the king's privy chamber. In 1521, he was in Cardinal Wolsey's household. And he slowly starts to sort of work his way up, if you like, at the Tudor court.
Yeah, certainly lots of experience at court by the time his sister comes to the throne anyway. Um, so,
Yes.
so sometime before 1518, Edward marries a woman that you've already mentioned, Catherine Filliol. So talk to us about what we know of Catherine, their relationship, and that scandal that you alluded to earlier that eventually engulfed their marriage.
Catherine Filliol is something of an enigma, but some of her early life can be pinned down. She, like Edward, was born sometime around 1500. In reality, she was probably a couple of years older, probably more likely she was born in about 1503. And she was the daughter of Sir William Filliol and Dorothy Iffield, who had an estate at Woodlands near Horton in Dorset. They also had a property at Filliol's Hall near Kelvedon in Essex, which is where the Essex connection comes from. I live in Essex. The estate at Woodlands is relatively close to Wolf Hall, which of course was the Seymour family seat. And it seems that a match was planned between their two families from a fairly young age. Nothing can be pinned down for certain, but it seems that this was always intended, and it made perfect sense. Their lands pretty much adjoined each other. There's only about 50 miles between them. It would have made sense. And just prior to Edward's going to France in the train of Mary Tudor, he and Catherine married. And Catherine was sent to live at Wolf Hall with her husband's family, which of course included his sisters, Jane, Elizabeth, and Dorothy. She was a little bit older, but obviously they would have got to know each other quite well. And Catherine was pregnant by about 1526 or 1527. So she had fulfilled her dynastic duty and she would go on to bear a son. But sometime prior to 1527, and this is where it all gets a bit difficult, Catherine and Edward had quarrelled with her father. And he made sure that his will, dated 1527, disinherited both Catherine and Edward. Instead, he left her £40 if she would live virtuously and abide in some house of religion or of religious women. Basically, if she took herself off to a convent, he would pay her £40, which wasn't an insignificant sum. But if not, then they were completely disinherited, which is very peculiar. And he doesn't give any reason for this. Traditionally, perhaps it's been thought that this was sort of where their marriage started to fall apart. In reality, it didn't. There is no evidence of marital discord at this time. Their first child is a son named John. And in 1529, she bears him a second son, Edward. So clearly they were still getting on pretty well at this point. But soon afterwards, Edward Seymour repudiates his wife. Why is a complete mystery, really, but there are some theories that have been put forward. Later historians, and I stress here later because there is no contemporary evidence for this, have suggested that Catherine was unfaithful. And the legend persists that she had an affair with her father-in-law. But this is based on a much later 17th century reference. So that is clearly not the case. There's another one that follows in the 19th century, but there's nothing any earlier than that is evidence for this supposed affair with her father-in-law. So I think we can discount that. Peter Hellion also accuses her of infidelity, but he says that Edward learnt of her infidelity through witchcraft when he consulted a soothsayer, if you like, when he was in France. So again, this is not really sounding terribly likely, but clearly something did happen. Edward makes no move to disinherit their children at this point, and there is also no evidence at all of discord between him and his father. I think we can safely discount the idea that she has had an affair with her father-in-law, but perhaps she did have an affair, because clearly something has happened here, but there is no evidence for this. Historians have also claimed that there was a great scandal. And while there was clearly a scandal, Henry VIII did not like scandal. In fact, he was a bit of a prude when it didn't come to his own love life. So, although there was some kind of issue, the idea that there was a huge scandal that rocked the court seems unlikely, because had there been so, Henry would not have continued to favour Edward and the Seymour family to the extent he did. It seems unlikely. So the question is, what actually happens to Catherine? Catherine retires to a nunnery, and there are some options for this. I searched and searched, but I was unable to find any evidence of where she actually went. But she does go to a nunnery. The one option is that Catherine herself wanted to do this, and that Edward supported it. There is precedent for this. This would have been allowed. However, the great problem with it is that under canon law, if you like, at the time, had Edward given Catherine permission to do this, he would have been required to remain celibate for the rest of her life. It seems unlikely that Edward would have agreed to this. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. The second option is that Catherine was unwell, that she was sick, and that by sending her to the nunnery, he was in fact sending her to the best sort of medical care available. As we now know, sort of that this happened to Elizabeth Woodville now. We think that's what happened in all likelihood. But again, Catherine lives for a good few years, so perhaps not. A third interpretation, and one that's very tentative, I stress, is that Catherine perhaps did have an affair, or perhaps she was assaulted, and that she and Edward both felt that a religious refuge would be the best way forward. There is no evidence really to support any of these options. So it could have been any, it could have even been a combination of all of them. And as I said, the question of exactly where Catherine was sent, the nunneries at Shaftesbury or Wilton would have been the obvious choices. They were local and would have befitted her rank and status. But again, there's no evidence. I've found no evidence that she was sent there. I will also just add, before we sort of start to wrap Catherine up, is that sending her to a nunnery might not have been quite what we think it was. The idea that she was shut away and never saw the light of day again. In all likelihood, this would not have been the case. There's plenty of evidence for nuns at this time going out and about on adventures, seeing their families, and living in quite luxurious circumstances, really. If she had money, and we know she did, amongst other things, her father left her that £40, she would have been able to live in relative comfort. She would have, of course, had access to books and things. And there is, of course, the possibility that she continued to see her children. Again, there's no evidence for that, but it's easy to cast Edward Seymour as the villain here, shutting away his wife. But in all likelihood, it probably wasn't quite as most people would think of it today.
Gosh, what a mystery. And it shows the importance of delving into those sources, because, of course, lots of people do say she had an affair with her father-in-law, which I think is completely unfair if there's no evidence for that. So thank you. Really interesting. So you mentioned earlier Anne Stanhope, which is, of course, Edward's second wife. So tell us a little bit about her. Who was she, and why does Edward then decide on a match with her?
Well, Anne Stanhope was a sort of a noble woman. She was the daughter of Elizabeth Bourchier, and her stepfather, Richard Page, was again quite popular, riding quite high at the court. And at about 16, she was placed as a maid-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. She would, in fact, go on to serve every one of Henry VIII's wives. The most interesting thing about her, the start of her career in the household of Catherine of Aragon, is that there she met, of course, Catherine and Henry's daughter, the Princess Lady Mary, whatever we want to call her, at this stage, Princess. And they became firm friends. And it was a friendship that would endure until Mary's death and would actually play a very crucial role in Anne Stanhope's life. But yes, she served Catherine of again, and then, of course, she served Anne Boleyn. Given her later reformist views, it seems likely that she first encountered sort of the idea of religious reform in Anne Boleyn's learned household. And we know that she had married Edward Seymour sometime by 1555, when Catherine was dead at this point. She had died at some point previously. How Anne and Edward met, we don't know, but they were both at the court. Edward was a bit of a rising star, as I said, and Stanhope was serving the Queen, so it was really a perfect match. And they were both fairly ambitious. So yeah, it made quite a promising start, I think.
Absolutely. And so we mentioned, of course, Edward's sister Jane, one of his sisters, who becomes Henry VIII's third wife and queen in 1536. So how does this impact Edward's career and his prospects at court?
Well, it has long been thought that the Seymour family, specifically Edward and Anne, coached Jane to catch the king's eye. Again, the evidence for this is flimsy at best. But we do know that they acted as chaperones during Henry and Jane's romance. In fact, Cromwell was kicked out of his apartments at Greenwich, and they were given to Edward and Anne so that Henry could visit Jane in privacy, but maintain an air of respectability. Obviously, their star sort of is very much on the rise. Edward's career fairly skyrockets as Henry and Jane's relationship develops. Following Jane's marriage, Edward Seymour is made Viscount Beauchamp, however we want to pronounce it, and given a vast amount of land, various other titles, etc. We also get a few glimpses of Anne. We know that she is at Jane's side on several occasions. On the 3rd of June, for example, she is in the royal barge, wearing velvet and an English gabled hood, along with Jane and Henry in London. We also know that she was with Jane during her confinement, and Anne herself was heavily pregnant at the time. So yes, the marriage sort of skyrocketed them right to the top of the food chain at court, I guess. It's interesting to also note that around this time, when Edward is receiving all these titles and this land, it is specified that his property and titles will be inherited by his children by Anne, not by Catherine. And this is the first indication we have that he is planning or considering disinheriting his first two sons. Why we don't know, but it is interesting that that's the first reference we have to it.
Yeah, that is interesting. And so you mentioned that Anne is at court serving various queens. So what is her relationship like with Catherine Parr?
Well, again, traditionally, of course, Catherine Parr refers to Anne Stanhope in one furious letter as that hell. And it is a sort of epithet that has stuck to poor Anne ever since. But they began life anyway as good friends. And of course, they would later become sisters-in-law. But Anne Stanhope, or I'm going to use Stanhope, it's just easier, was present when Henry married Catherine Parr in 1544. And they were good friends and equally fervent about education and about learning and about reform. Both were highly educated and very intelligent women. We know that there was certainly warmth between them. On several occasions, there's evidence that Catherine spoke with the king, asking him, for example, to bring Edward back from the north, because Anne required him at home. And it was a fairly warm friendship. And both, of course, were enmeshed in the scandal regarding Anne Askew, who, of course, was targeted to bring down the Queen and her ladies. The plot famously failed, of course, because Catherine Parr got wind of it. But Anne was completely involved in every way in this. There is evidence to suggest that Anne Seymour actually sent money to Anne Askew when she was in the Tower. And Anne Askew's nephew would later claim that Anne Stanhope was a key part of the reformist network that was bringing books into the court, sort of in operation around the Queen. He called it the Queen's reformist network. And of course, if Anne Stanhope did send money to Anne Askew, she was taking a terrible risk. But I would argue it speaks to the depth of her reformist convictions. She is very much a reformist by this point. And like Catherine Parr did, Anne staked her safety, her entire life really, on the fact that Anne Askew would not speak, which of course she didn't, and they were all safe. But yes, so her and Catherine were very much in it together at this point. But when Henry VIII died, Edward Seymour becomes Lord Protector, and Anne is now the foremost lady in the land. Catherine, it seems, wasn't thrilled about this, but still they're working together. There's no evidence of any great row. When Catherine marries Thomas Seymour, they become sisters-in-law, and Anne, while there's no evidence she completely disapproved, she wasn't particularly thrilled. She thought Catherine hadn't behaved quite as well as she could have, and Catherine wanted Anne's support, and she didn't get it, again, quite as much as she wished. There is an argument over some jewels. Catherine wanted the jewels, Anne wanted the jewels. It's not terribly easy to get right to the heart of this issue, but it seems to stem from the fact that an inventory was taken of the Queen's jewels, and which would have been quite usual, but Catherine didn't necessarily want to give them up for this inventory, and she wasn't very happy about it. So it's, again, the truth appears to be rather less dramatic than later sort of stories would have us believe. But there was definite sort of an enmity did develop when Elizabeth was placed in Thomas Seymour's household, Princess Elizabeth. Anne was horrified when she heard rumours of the conduct of Thomas Seymour and tried to tell Catherine to sort out her household. This did not go down terribly well. But again, I will stress that although there's evidence of quarrels, and as I said, in a fit of temper, Catherine calls her that hell, there is also evidence that their friendship was continuing. They continued to talk on domestic matters. They continued to both be in the same place. They continued to pay some visits. It's not sort of the falling out to end all arguments. Anne issues probably her sharpest rebuke early in 1548, again regarding Elizabeth. But of course, Anne and Catherine, well, Catherine is pregnant by this point, so is Anne. Anne is delivered safely of a son, but Catherine, as we know, dies in childbirth. And her daughter Mary is taken into Anne's care immediately after her death. This would later change as per Catherine and Thomas's wishes. So I think their relationship was fascinating, but like most things, a lot more complex than sort of later stories would have us believe. I think they started out as friends and then quarrelled like most people do, and then were friends again and then not, and yeah, it was
very complex relationship, absolutely. And so can we just
indeed.
Can we just go back to Anne's religious beliefs for a moment and that association with Anne Askew that you mentioned? So tell us a little bit more about what Anne believed. Of course, the term reformist is very fluid at this period. So what were her religious beliefs?
Again, it is difficult to pin down exactly what she believed, but she certainly believed that, I think at the core of her belief was education. She believed in education. She believed in learning from books. She believed in having access to as many books and documents as she could. And she believed in reading them, and she believed in educating her children, specifically her daughters. It would not be unusual for a son to be educated, but the Seymour daughters are educated to a very high degree. So this is very much what she believes, and she does not believe in transubstantiation. That is also clear from the works that are dedicated to her and that the Seymours support. She is not a Catholic. But as I said, I think for her, and again, I stress this is only speculation, this is my opinion, I think that for her, it really was all about the education. She is exposed at court to the sort of religious texts that we know are flooding England at this time. The Reformation is, of course, kicking off big time in Europe. Edward himself was exposed to the Reformation when he was sent by Cardinal Wolsey. I'm trying to remember when. Sorry, the date appears to be escaping me. But he's exposed sort of when he goes to Europe. We know his religious beliefs develop alongside Anne's. But yes, I would stress at heart is sort of the idea of education and access to works. Of course, the Bible in English is a huge thing. Texts in English, not in Latin. You're not having to go to a third party to access the word of God as she saw it. And yeah, I think that was sort of at the heart of her faith.
And of course, we know that the story for the Seymour brothers does not end well, unfortunately. So how is Anne impacted by the fall of Thomas, both Thomas and Edward Seymour?
The fall of Thomas, I don't think, again, history would have us believe that Thomas Seymour lost his head because Anne persuaded her husband that he had to go. I've actually seen that written in some history books. Obviously, it's far more complicated than that. There's a good deal of evidence that Anne actually quite liked him at times. Impacted by his death personally, I think she probably felt sorrow, but other than that, sort of they moved on. The fall of her husband, of course, was rather different. The first time Edward Seymour is imprisoned in the Tower of London, as soon as this happens, Anne springs into action. She goes straight to Jane Dudley, her great friend and wife of the Duke of Northumberland, who is seeking to replace Edward Seymour as head of the council, the government, if you like. And together they plot to mend the rift between their husbands. And they act very quickly. Essentially, when Northumberland comes home, Anne flings herself at his feet, flatters, bewilders, and beguiles him, which is a direct quote. Northumberland is horrified and embarrassed. They have been great friends. They then speak. Jane Dudley comes out. They have a conversation. And soon enough, Edward is released from the Tower. The next time, of course, Edward is sent to the Tower, things go rather differently. Notably, this time, Anne is sent straight to the Tower along with him. There is no chance for her to reach Jane Dudley. There is no chance for her to plead for her husband. And they are sent to the Tower. Edward on the 16th of October, Anne a day later. And immediately it is clear that this is a much more serious imprisonment. Their children are placed in the care of Sir William Paulet, and they're not allowed contact with each other. The arrest actually was generally very unpopular among the common people. Edward Seymour was known as the Good Duke, and was popular across the whole country, but not at the court. And Edward Seymour is, of course, executed. Anne believes that she is going to be executed as well. The day after her husband's death, she sends for her chaplain, believing that her death is imminent, but it isn't. Edward Seymour is executed in the January. By the June, she is allowed visits from her mother, and she is allowed to live quite comfortably in the Tower. But she is not allowed very much contact with the outside world. In 1553, Bishop Hooper is allowed to visit her and bring her books, which of course would have been a big thing for Anne. Of course, Edward's lands and titles have all been confiscated, children disinherited. One of her servants, the steward in the household, a man by the name of Francis Newdigate, does his best to save what of the Seymour property they can. But Anne remains in the Tower until the death of Edward. Edward VI dies in 1553, and Mary Tudor becomes queen. And this is where their lifelong friendship certainly pays off for Anne. As I said, they became great friends. And despite them being on the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of faith, this friendship endures. Mary refers to Anne as my good Nan in her letters, more interestingly as my good gossip. Mary refuses to speak out against the Seymours in the same way Anne had supported Mary in her desire to continue to hear Mass. Matters of religion don't appear to have come between them. But for Anne's later life, when Mary becomes queen, one of her first acts is to release Anne from the Tower. She does this at the same time as she sanctioned Bishop Gardiner's release. Gardiner, of course, was Mary's strongest ally, if you like. So the fact that Anne's release is sanctioned at the same time, I think, speaks to just how important their friendship was.
And so, what is life like for Anne following her husband's death, especially given that Mary is now on the throne? She's Catholic, even though you've said that, they are close friends. What does she do after that?
Well, she survives, and she does it brilliantly. Mary restores her to her position as Duchess of Somerset, allows her to live at Sion House, which had previously been her home, and allows her to live in the manner to which she had become accustomed. She is granted money, and she is often at the court. In fact, Anne Seymour comes out on top, very much. And in 1558, she is given the manor of Hanworth for life, which is a lovely property. Excellent hunting, and we know that her friendship with Queen Mary continued. Anne also remarries to Francis Newdigate, her former steward/servant. He's described as both in the sources, so exactly what rank he was, we're not sure. But they marry in either late 1558 or early 1559. Of course, Mary dies in 1558, which was a huge personal blow for Anne, but she continues to prosper under Elizabeth, who was also a friend. In 1559, she grants Anne and her husband the use of Chelsea Place in London, which was a great honour. And systematically, Anne recovers her estates and begins to plot marriages for her children. There is, of course, another scandal, no shortage of them here, but Anne opposes her son Edward's plan to marry Catherine Grey, a marriage that horrified Elizabeth, and as we know, it did not end well for any of them. But Elizabeth was well aware that Anne was firmly on her side. And in fact, Edward and Catherine's two sons were placed in Anne's care, which I think is pretty symbolic of the amount of trust Elizabeth had in Anne. Anne continues to crop up in various sources. We know that Elizabeth dines often with her, and Anne is often at the court. For example, in August 1580, we know that Elizabeth went to stay with Anne at Hanworth, and Anne has pretty much at this time clawed back everything that her family had lost. In 1580, her second husband dies, but it doesn't seem to have affected her very much. Her health isn't always great, but in 1585, we know she is back at court at the side of the Queen. But in 1586, she draws up her will. She makes many bequests to her friends, her family. And on the 16th of April, 1587, she dies peacefully at Hanworth, with her family at her side. And according to Elizabeth's wishes and her own, she is buried in St. Nicholas's Chapel in Westminster Abbey, remaining in royal favour to the very last.
What a story. Incredible. That's an amazing story. So, Rebecca, if people want to find out more about you and your work, where can they go?
I would suggest going to our Substack. I have a Substack with Amy. It's called the Tudor Notebook. And we post on there regularly we post book reviews about our various travels, our research, and our books.
Wonderful. I do follow that wonderful Substack. So I'll pop a link to that in our show notes for everyone to find. But there is one more thing that I do on the podcast when I first have guests on the show, and that's what I call 10 to go. So these are just 10 quick questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one is, what is a favorite historic site that you enjoy visiting, perhaps associated with some of the people we've been chatting about?
I would always have to say a place called Castle Acre Priory. It's up in Norfolk, and it is one of the most complete ruined priories in England. It is beautiful, and I think it also stands as testament to the Reformation because parts of it are very complete, and you can walk around it as the monks would have. But of course, it is also suffered great destruction during the Reformation. So yeah, I like to think it sort of bears witness to the Reformation, and there are parts of it where it feels very immediate, that you are looking at the same stones the monks would have looked at, that Cromwell's men would have seen when they ripped off the roof. So I would say Castle Priory.
Wonderful. That's not one that anyone has mentioned before, so thank you. What about the a last book that you read, or perhaps one that you're currently reading at the moment?
The last one I finished was Joanne Paule's excellent biography of Thomas More that has just come out, which I thought was absolutely amazing. Specifically, the research she's done on Thomas More's early life. As I mentioned before, I'm an archaeologist, and I've done some excavations around the Cripplegate area. And medieval sort of London, I find absolutely fascinating. The fact some of the churches still stand and you can still plot some of the old medieval streets. Again, I think it really brings history to life, if you like. And her research is absolutely excellent, and she evokes sort of the atmosphere around Cripplegate, where Thomas More likely grew up, very well.
Wonderful. And yes, if you're listening and haven't listened to the episode I recorded with Joanne, please do that as well. What about...
I have listened to that.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. What about a film that you go back to and have rewatched, maybe for comfort, for entertainment purposes?
I don't watch a huge number of films. I'm not a big film watcher. I guess it wouldn't be a historical film at all. I would say probably Lord of the Rings.
Oh yes, that's a good one.
As a film, yes, it's a bit, yeah, it's a very popular one, but it's great for just sort of comfort. Good guys win, bad guys don't. It's great.
Absolutely, I love that one. And when you were a child, what did you hope to become when you were an adult, when you grew up?
I'm an archaeologist.
Ah, well, that's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, I was always fascinated by history. And that was my aim right from the very start. So I went to university with the aim of studying archaeology, which of course I did. So
wonderful. Yeah. Oh, that's so lovely to hear. And what about a way that you find inspiration? If you're not feeling particularly creative on a certain day, what do you do to get yourself back in that inspired mode?
Probably go for a walk. I live in a very rural part of England. I'm surrounded by fields in every direction.
Nice.
So I tend to, yes, go for a walk. I would sort of walk around the fields. This is a very old, I live in a very old village. The origins go right back to the Bronze Age. The church has a tower that dates to about 1570. My own house dates to about then. So
wow.
I would go for a walk, I guess. The road through the middle of the village is Roman, so I would walk down that. And yes, there's plenty of historical inspiration around here.
Yeah, sounds like it. Amazing. And what about a new skill that you might like to learn?
Well, I don't know. I guess my son likes to climb, and he's very, very keen for me to try that. Keeps trying to persuade me. So I guess that would be kind of fun. See if I could do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. That does sound like fun. And what does an ideal Friday night look like for you these days?
Again, my son's very into history as well. So we tend to read books together.
Oh, that's so nice.
So we read aloud and talk about the book. At the moment, unfortunately, we're reading one about Napoleon because he's very keen on Napoleon. So I would say probably doing that, but a book on a more interesting period.
I absolutely love that. That's so funny. But how lovely to sit with your son and read history books. That's like a dream, absolute dream come true. And what about something that you do to relax and unwind after you've had all these busy days working? What do you like to do?
Bit of a cliche, but I like to read.
Yeah.
Yeah. That has always sort of been my go-to escapism.
Wonderful. Yeah. Love it. I could, absolutely agree with you. And very last question for you is, do you have a great piece of advice that either you've been given at some point, or you've heard, or you've read related to absolutely anything that you might be able to share with us?
Oh, that's a bit of a tricky one. I guess it would be the idea that the more effort you put in, the more you put in, the more you get out. So the greater the amount of effort you put into something, the greater the reward. Not necessarily monetary
No,
reward,
no.
but the better you're going to feel about something. So if you do it and you give it your absolute best shot, even if it's a complete failure, you're going to feel good about it.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you.
Yeah.
And there is one more thing, and it's the Tudor takeaway. So I do ask all my guests for a takeaway. This is something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
I would. Oh, I'm trying to think now. I should possibly have
It might be
prepared
a
this answer.
website, a book, a song to listen to, a film to watch. Could be anything, really.
I would say possibly, again, others have probably said this, but the Tudor Times that looks at the Tudors, looks at a lot of Tudor buildings, I think is really interesting. And lots of people there
The
are
website or the
doing,
magazine? Do you mean Tudor
it's the
Places or
magazine.
Tudor
It's
Places?
the
Yeah, I
magazine.
love that. I
Yeah.
love it. Yeah.
Yes. Really very interesting. A lot of research done on some lesser known places. They had a great article the other month on Collie Weston,
Yeah.
Margaret Beaufort's house. Yeah, so I'd probably say that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And Debbie, who runs it, is amazing. So love that
Yes.
takeaway. Thank you so much. And Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time to talk tutors with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much.